Russia launched a wave of missile and drone strikes in Ukraine on New Year's Eve, hitting a number of residential and other civilian targets. At least one person was killed in Kyiv. Russia and Ukraine carried out a prisoner swap on Saturday that saw 140 Ukrainians return to the country for 82 Russians. Such prisoner swaps have been carried out periodically during the conflict. Ukrainian armed forces repelled Russian attacks in more than 10 directions, Ukraine's general staff reports. Donetsk and Luhansk regions remain the most active battlefields. Russia continued to shell civilian settlements through the whole front line, hitting residences and critical infrastructure. Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, Dnipro and Kherson regions were under strikes Saturday morning as well as Kyiv. Ukraine faced a fresh round of missile and drone strikes on New Year Eve, as Kyiv authorities had predicted. Sirens blared across the country starting around midday, while Ukrenergo implemented temporary power cuts in the Odessa, Mykolaiv, Dnipro and Kyiv regions to reduce the overload in the power system to protect against strikes, local authorities said. Kyiv City Mayor Vitaly Klitschko said that 3 schools, a kindergarten, and several private houses were damaged in the attacks. A Japanese journalist was among 16 people injured, Klitschko said on Telegram. President Zelensky said the latest attacks are proof that support for Ukraine should be increased, he said in a video address. Since the beginning of Russia's invasion, Ukraine's spending on defense and security hit 1.2 trillion hryvnia, $32 billion, a government website said, citing Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal. More than 250 billion hryvnia was directed to purchases of ammunition and repairs. Zelensky said Ukraine's air defense could become the most powerful in Europe, which he said would help the defense of the continent as well as his nation. Russia's defense ministry said 82 Russian soldiers had been released by Ukraine, while Yermak said Russia had handed over 140 Ukrainian service personnel. Some of the 132 Ukrainian men and 8 women who were freed had been wounded or had fought to defend the Black Sea port city of Mariupol and on Snake Island, Yermak said in a message on his Telegram page. The two sides have exchanged hundreds of captured soldiers in several rounds of prisoner exchanges in recent months, despite a complete breakdown in broader diplomatic talks between Moscow and Kyiv. Russia on Saturday stationed air defenses over Moscow and handed out shelter directions to citizens in Belgorod near the Ukrainian border in preparation for New Year's festivities. Some 2,000 servicemen will oversee Moscow's air defenses while on duty at combat posts on New Year's Eve, Russia's defense ministry said according to state-owned media outlet TASS. The region of Belgorod, which shares a border with Ukraine's Kharkiv Oblast and whose regional capital sits roughly 20 miles inland from the border, has seen several strikes in recent months as Ukrainian forces have pushed the front line further east. Ukraine ousted Russian forces from Kharkiv in September, and by October Belgorod reportedly began to see an increase in shelling. The regional governor claimed a massive fire broke out in mid-October after shelling fell on a Russian oil depot. Shelling in the region then killed 2 in November and power lines were reportedly damaged in early December. A police expert holds a fragment of a drone with a handwritten inscription reading, "For Belgorod." For Luch, after a drone attack in Kyiv on October 17, 2022, amid the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Another shelling incident was reported on December 18 in which 1 person was killed, 8 others injured and a dozen residential building damaged, according to the regional governor, Vyacheslav Gladkov. Explosions shook Kyiv on Saturday, December 31, as Russia carried out a second major round of missile attacks on Ukraine in 3 days. 10 loud blasts were reported to have been heard, with the capital's mayor Vitaly Klitschko saying at least 1 person had been killed and 8 wounded. Whilst Kyiv and other cities across Ukraine were coming under fire, video was released of Russian President Vladimir Putin raising a glass with soldiers. He was at an army headquarters in southern Russia presenting an award to General Sergei Surovikin, the head of the military operation in Ukraine. Earlier Putin had delivered a New Year's address in which he framed the conflict as a near-existential fight for the future of Russia. The West, he said, was using Ukraine and was intent on destroying Russia. For months Moscow presented the war, which it describes as a special military operation, as a limited campaign that would not affect most Russians' lives. But it was unprepared for Ukraine's staunch resistance and the billions of dollars in Western weapons that have turned the tide in Ukraine's favor. Almost half of Kyiv and nearly the entire city of Lviv are without power Thursday after Russia launched another massive missile strike across Ukraine using air and sea-based cruise missiles. Ukraine's Air Force shot down 54 of the 69 missiles fired at western cities like Lviv, Kyiv and Odessa in its latest large-scale missile strike that targeted civilian and energy infrastructure. Russian missile strikes battered Ukraine, including in major cities like Kyiv, Kharkiv and Lviv on December 29, leaving at least 5 people injured and cutting electricity in the west. Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko said 16 missiles had been shot down over the capital city, though he did not confirm how many missiles were fired in total. At least 3 people were injured in the strikes on Kyiv, including a 14-year-old girl, after debris from a downed missile crashed into a private residence. Klitschko said 40% of the city was without power but said engineers were working to restore the energy supplies. A whopping 90% of the western city of Lviv is without power after explosions were reported by the city mayor. Lviv Mayor Andriy Sadovy warned that water supplies may also be cut off and urged citizens to stay in shelters as the city works to get generators up and running. Odessa in southwestern Ukraine stopped 21 missiles fired at it, according to Kyiv Independent. Progress on the front lines has largely stalled, though intense fighting in Donetsk and particularly around Bakhmut continues. Russian forces have gone on the defensive in other regions, including Kherson and Luhansk, as they look to hold on to the territory they occupy. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in a Saturday address pointedly told Russia that no one will ever forgive you after the country unleashed a wave of missile attacks on Ukraine on New Year's Eve. Zelensky, who recently traveled to the United States to meet with President Joe Biden and speak before a joint session of Congress, was forceful in stating that Russians were akin to following the devil. Russia in the last few days has led major 2 rounds of missile strikes on Ukraine, with the attacks affecting the capital city of Kyiv and other parts of the country on Saturday. The strikes killed at least 1 person and have injured 14 individuals, according to the Associated Press. Zelensky went on to say that Russian President Vladimir Putin is hiding and warned that neither Ukraine nor the world community would forgive the violent attacks on his country. And what will be with all of you, citizens of Russia, does not concern him, he said. Your leader wants to show that he has the troops behind him and that he is ahead. But he's hiding. He hides behind the troops, missiles, his residences, palaces. Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and with the new year approaching, it will soon be nearly a full year since the start of the conflict. The US has not encouraged nor enabled Ukraine to carry out strikes against Moscow within Russian borders, Secretary of State Antony Blinken confirmed late Tuesday. Blinken said the US, along with its international partners, is determined to make sure Ukraine has what it needs to defend themselves, to defend their territory, to defend their freedom. Kyiv has not claimed responsibility for the alleged drone strikes, but it has appeared to celebrate the attacks. The strikes, if in fact they were launched on Kyiv's orders, show not only Ukraine's increasing willingness to hit Russia back on its own territory, but also reflect Russia's domestic defense vulnerabilities. 2 separate strikes on Monday hit Russia's Engels air base in the southeast Saratov region and the Dyagilevo airfield, located near the city of Ryazan, roughly 125 miles southeast of Moscow. 3 people were reportedly killed in the strikes, and at least 2 Tu-95 Bear heavy bombers were damaged in the explosions. The UK Defence Ministry on Tuesday said Engels' airbase, some 370 miles from Ukrainian-controlled territory, serves as Moscow's main operating base for its long-range aviation in western Russia and is home to more than 30 heavy bombers. The strikes followed warnings from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that Russian forces are planning something, along with an increase in Russian aerial attacks. Blinken said it was in the US's interest to continue to support Ukraine in its fight against Russia and stop any precedent that may allow aggressors to believe they can redraw regional borders by force. When asked if the US would work to prevent Ukraine from developing its long-range strike technology, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said no. Russia and Ukraine said on Saturday they had freed more than 200 captured soldiers, the latest prisoner exchange between the 2 sides in the 10-month-old conflict. Russia's defense ministry said 82 Russian soldiers had been released by Ukraine, while the Ukrainian president's chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, said Russia had handed over 140 Ukrainian service personnel. Some of the 132 Ukrainian men and 8 women who were freed had been wounded or had fought to defend the Black Sea port city of Mariupol and on Snake Island, Yermak said in a message on his Telegram page. The 2 sides have exchanged hundreds of captured soldiers in several rounds of prisoner exchanges in recent months, despite a complete breakdown in broader diplomatic talks between Moscow and Kyiv. American veterans volunteered to help Ukraine fight after Russia invaded the country in February. Congress passed landmark legislation to help service members affected by toxic exposure, and the Defense Department is retiring the National Defense Service Medal on December 31st. Along with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and veterans issues, these were the top headlines in 2022 and, as such, the articles most viewed by Military Times readers. After a military buildup, Russian President Vladimir Putin sent his troops into Ukraine on February 24 for what he has called a special military operation. Within days, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky created the International Legion of Territorial Defense of Ukraine and invited volunteers from other countries to fight alongside Ukrainians in defense of the country. A number of American veterans joined the fight against the Russian invasion, but not all of them would not return home. At least 10 Americans have died fighting in Ukraine, and at least 2 Americans were taken captive. Military veterans Alex Druick and Andy Huynh, both from Alabama, were captured and held for 3 months before they were released. Meanwhile, roughly 20,000 U.S. troops were mobilized throughout Central and Eastern Europe in anticipation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and then in response to it. Most are posted in partner nations, training with local troops. Military Times' comprehensive coverage on the war in Ukraine includes live updates from the days immediately following the invasion, U.S. military aid sent to Ukraine, and analysis from defense leaders. Russian President Vladimir Putin says his country will never give in to the West's attempts to use Ukraine as a tool to destroy Russia. In a New Year's video message broadcast on Russian state TV, Putin said Russia was fighting in Ukraine to protect its motherland and to secure true independence for its people. In a 9-minute message, the longest New Year's address of his 2-decade rule, Putin accused the West of lying to Russia and of provoking Moscow to launch what it calls a special military operation in Ukraine. In fact, in every possible way they were encouraging neo-Nazis who conducted open terrorism against civilians in the Donbass, Putin said in an uncharacteristically combative New Year's speech, usually dedicated to well wishes for the year ahead. Earlier on Saturday, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu had vowed victory in Ukraine was inevitable, as he praised the heroism of Russian soldiers fighting on the front lines and those who had died during the 10-month war. The West lied about peace, Putin said. It was preparing for aggression, and now they are cynically using Ukraine and its people to weaken and split Russia. Kyiv and the West reject Moscow's claims over the start of the conflict and say Putin launched a baseless war of aggression in a bid to seize territory and topple Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Russia's presidential administration has developed a manual for authorities and pro-Kremlin media outlets, explaining how exactly they should sum up 2022. In the main themes section, the document's authors recommend emphasizing the usual Kremlin line: sending Russian troops into Ukraine. Vladimir Putin made the only right decision, preventing an impending attack by Ukraine and NATO on Russian territory. The handbook says that Western countries have been preparing to attack Russia since 2014 and were planning to divide and conquer the Russian people. Russia now has 89 regions, and its territorial area has increased by 80,000 square kilometers, over 30,000 square miles. This territory is 3 times larger than Crimea, and 2 times larger than Slovakia or Croatia, Denmark or Switzerland. The expansion of Russia's borders due to the reunification of the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions means that Crimea has ceased to be an island cut off from the Russian mainland. In the section on strengthening Russia, the text's authors recommend emphasizing Russia's closely united society. They connect Putin's high popularity. According to the Russian State's polling center, 78.5% of respondents trust him, directly to Russians' unconditional support for the SVO. However, as Meduza has previously reported, even authorities' secret polls confirm that Russians are tired of the war and want peaceful negotiations with Ukraine. In the New World Order section, the handbook calls Russia a leader of countries that do not recognize Western exceptionalism and a leader of a just, democratic, and multipolar world. The Kremlin's handbook says that Putin is giving Europe a chance to come to its senses and regain its subjectivity and its future. In a statement to CNN, the U.S. State Department spokesperson expressed concerns about China's alignment with Russia as Moscow continues its brutal and unlawful invasion of Ukraine. The statement came after Russian and Chinese leaders Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping held a phone call on December 30. Beijing claims to be neutral, but its behavior makes clear it is still investing in close ties to Russia, the spokesperson told CNN, adding that those that side with Moscow in this unjust war will inevitably find themselves on the wrong side of history. The spokesperson said that the US and the EU had warned China of the consequences of providing Russia with military assistance for its war against Ukraine or systematic assistance with sanctions evasion. On December 30, she told Putin that China is ready to increase political cooperation with Russia to be global partners. On December 22, China's and Russia's naval forces engaged in joint military drills in the East China Sea, the latest in a series of exercises that showcase the deepening defense ties between the two countries. In a video released early on December 31, Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov addressed Russians, warning them of a second wave of mobilization early in the new year. Speaking in Russian, Reznikov said that in early 2023, Russia planned to close border exits to men, declare martial law, and launch another wave of mobilization. He added that it was unlikely Russian authorities would include mobilization plans in their New Year addresses. Reznikov said that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was not going to plan, despite the Kremlin's insistence it was. He noted major incidents in the war, such as the sinking of Russia's Moskva flagship in the Black Sea early in the conflict, and recent Ukrainian strikes on military targets deep within Russian territory. He urged Russians eligible for conscription to avoid mobilization by all means. Reznikov's New Year's Eve address came after Ukraine's military intelligence chief Kyrylo Budanov told the Ukrainian service the Russian government planned to start another wave of mobilization from January 5. President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Saturday that his only wish for all Ukrainians for 2023 was victory and resolve to stay the course while the country fights for it. Russia's President Vladimir Putin launched his invasion of Ukraine on February 24, calling it a special operation to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine, which he said was a threat to Russia. Kyiv and its Western allies say Putin's invasion was merely an imperialist land grab. Putin used his own New Year's address to rally the Russian people behind troops fighting in Ukraine. While Moscow had planned a swift operation to take over its neighbor, the war is now in its 11th month, marked by many embarrassing Russian battlefield setbacks and Ukraine's successful defense of most of its land. Russian forces have been engaged for months now in fierce fighting in the east and south of Ukraine, to defend the lands Moscow proclaimed it annexed in September and which make up the broader Ukrainian industrial Donbas region. On Saturday, Zelensky vowed to bring back what has been taken away. Let this year be the year of return. The return of our people. Soldiers, to their families. Prisoners, to their homes. Emigrants, to their Ukraine. Return of our lands, Zelensky said. According to the FT, in 2023, Russia's war against Ukraine will continue throughout the year. Blackouts in the EU may begin as soon as April, if the weather is cold. According to FT analysts, it will not be easy for the EU to replenish its underground gas storages after the end of the winter season. Global warming will not reach the 1.5-degree threshold until the end of the year, but it could happen by 2024. According to the analysts' estimates, the planet warmed by 1.1 degrees compared to the average temperature in 2011 to 2020. The U.S. Federal Reserve will not cut interest rates. By the end of 2023, they may grow by more than 5%. The analysts noted that the Fed has warned of plans to continue raising rates. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak will keep his position. According to the FT, Sunak is more resilient than his predecessors Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. At the same time, they believe that he can deal with pressure from members of the Conservative Party. The European Central Bank, ECB, will not support the bond markets of Italy and other EU countries. According to the FT's predictions, the yields of EU bonds will be limited, but the ECB will not provide them with support. US President Joe Biden will run for re-election. FT analysts believe that a Biden second term could be the most successful option for the Democratic Party. Former US President Donald Trump will be indicted. The newspaper notes that the US authorities have 4 reasons for this: an attempt to subvert the outcome of the 2020 presidential election, storage of classified documents after the end of the president's term of office, pressure on the representatives of the state of Georgia in the elections, and fraud. China will be able to achieve economic growth of more than 5% by the end of 2023. According to the FT, economic activity in the country will resume when the authorities can introduce a more liberal policy to combat the coronavirus. China will not attack Taiwan. FT analysts believe that if an invasion does take place, It will not be in 2023, but later. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan will keep his post after elections in the summer of 2023. According to the FT, for this, he could use honest and dishonest methods to win. His next term could worsen Turkey's economic problems. Protests in Iran will continue due to the consequences of Western sanctions. Rallies show Iranian citizens are tired of the current government, the FT wrote. FT analysts also believe that Twitter will retain its audience despite the social network's problems after its acquisition by businessman Elon Musk. In addition, FT analysts expect at least one more major cryptocurrency business will fail in 2023.